The cold at 25,000 feet could kill a man in minutes. Major Hans Brenner knew this because he had watched it happen, pilots bailing out over the Eastern Front, their parachutes blooming white against the gray winter sky, their bodies freezing solid before they touched the snow below. For years of war had taught him many things about death. He thought he understood them all, but he was wrong. Dawn broke over the frozen forests east of Minsk in late January 1944. Brenner led 4 Messerschmitt Bf 109s through air so cold their engines coughed and sputtered until the oil warmed. At 42 years old, he was ancient by fighter pilot standards. His men called him der Graue Wolf, the Grey Wolf, for the silver streaking through his dark hair and for the patient way he hunted. 147 confirmed kills decorated his record. He had survived when better men had died, and he had done it by never underestimating his enemies. The Soviet Air Force had evolved since 1941. Those early days of easy victories were gone. The Yak-1s and La-5s that now filled Russian squadrons were capable machines flown by pilots who had learned from 3 years of slaughter. Brenner respected them. He studied their tactics, memorized their aircraft specifications, knew exactly what each type could and could not do. At altitude, above 20,000 feet, his Messerschmitt still held the advantage. The Soviet engines lost power in thin air. German superchargers did not. This was the rule of the eastern sky. Brenner had built his survival upon it. Radio chatter crackled through his headset. His wingman, Lieutenant Weber, spotted the targets first, a formation of Ilyushin bombers heading west toward German positions, flying low over the tree-line. Weber was 23 years old, eager, talented, certain he would become an ace. Brenner remembered feeling that certainty once. They dove. The attack run was textbook. Brenner's flight screamed down from altitude, engines howling, the bombers growing huge in their gun sights. Soviet gunners opened fire, tracers arcing upward like orange threads. Weber claimed the first kill, a bomber trailing fire, spinning down into the forest. Brenner felt the familiar thump of his cannons, saw his own target shudder and break apart. Then the escorts arrived. Brenner saw them climbing from the east, 4 fighters rising fast through the thin morning light. He called the warning, already calculating angles and speeds. Soviet escorts usually stayed low, protecting their bombers from below. These were climbing. Climbing fast. Too fast. Something was wrong. The shapes resolved as they approached. Brenner's hands tightened on the stick. These were not Yaks. These were not Lavochkins. The silhouettes were different, longer noses, tricycle landing gear, American lines on Russian wings. He had seen recognition charts of Lend-Lease aircraft. The P-39 Airacobra. The P-63 Kingcobra. He had dismissed them as curiosities, American machines shipped to Russia in small numbers, probably inferior to German engineering. The lead Soviet fighter dove at him from above. It was impossible. Nothing climbed that fast at this altitude. Nothing should be above him. He had started at 25,000 feet. Weber never saw the attack coming. The Soviet pilot fired one burst from an impossibly large cannon. Brenner would later learn it was a 37mm weapon mounted in the propeller hub, and Weber's Messerschmitt disintegrated. No fire, no spin, just instant destruction. One moment a young man full of dreams, the next moment falling wreckage. Brenner ran that he pushed his throttle to the firewall and dove for the clouds below. His engine screamed. His airframe shuddered. Behind him, a Soviet fighter followed, matching his speed, closing the distance. At 20,000 feet, the gap narrowed. At 15,000, Brenner pulled into a desperate climbing turn, the maneuver that had saved his life 100 times before. The Soviet climbed with him, only luck saved him. He found a cloud bank and disappeared into it, flying blind on instruments, praying his pursuer would lose him in the gray void. Minutes passed. His hands shook on the controls. When he finally emerged, the sky was empty. That he landed at the Minsk airfield with fuel gauges touching red. The ground crew saw his face and asked no questions. He walked past them without speaking, past the other pilots emerging from the ready room, past the intelligence officer who wanted his report. He walked until he reached the empty bunk where Lieutenant Weber had slept. The boy's letter to his mother lay unfinished on the footlocker. Brenner picked it up. The handwriting was neat, careful, full of lies about safety and good food. He folded it and placed it in his pocket. That night, standing alone in the frozen darkness outside the barracks, Brenner forced himself to think clearly. The Soviet aircraft had outclimbed his Messerschmitt at altitude. It had matched his dive speed. Its cannon had destroyed a fighter with a single burst. Everything he knew about the air war, every rule, every advantage, every certainty, had been wrong. That he reported what he had seen. The intelligence officer nodded politely and wrote nothing down. Soviet aircraft cannot perform at altitude, the officer explained. German superchargers remain superior. The major must have been mistaken about the enemy's height. Brenner did not argue. He understood. They could not believe him because believing him meant admitting the rules had changed. In his quarters, he sat on his bunk and stared at the wall. Somewhere east of here, a Soviet pilot was celebrating a kill. Somewhere in Germany, a mother would soon receive a telegram about her son, and somewhere in the frozen sky, the future was waiting. The American engine purred like a satisfied predator. Captain Yuri Volkov throttled back as he descended toward the Soviet airbase, the Allison V-1710 responding with a smoothness no Russian-built motor could match. 1,200 horsepower. Supercharged for altitude performance. A 37mm cannon that fired through the propeller hub with enough force to crack a tank. The Bell P-63 Kingcobra was everything Soviet pilots had dreamed of receiving from their American allies, and everything the Germans had failed to anticipate. Volkov touched down on the frozen runway and taxied toward the dispersal area. Ground crews rushed forward, breath steaming in the -20 cold. He killed the engine and sat motionless in the cockpit, staring at the instrument panel without seeing it. He had killed 2 Germans today. One of them had been young. Volkov had seen his face through the canopy in that final instant before his cannon shell struck. Surprise. Fear. Then nothing. That he felt nothing in return. This emptiness had lived inside him since Stalingrad. That city of death, where the Volga ran red and aircraft fell from the sky like burning leaves. His original squadron, 12 pilots, 12 friends, 12 brothers, had flown into that furnace. Only Yuri Volkov had flown out. The others remained there still, buried under rubble or scattered across the steppe, their names carved on a memorial he would never visit. He climbed down from the Kingcobra. His wingman, Lieutenant Petrov, was already running toward him across the frozen tarmac, young face bright with excitement. Petrov was 20 years old, fresh from training, convinced that killing fascists was glorious work. He reminded Volkov of men he had once known. Men who had died believing the same thing. Captain. 2 confirmed kills. The commissar is writing the report himself. Petrov's voice cracked with enthusiasm. They say one of the Germans you let escape was an ace, over 100 victories. Volkov pulled off his flight gloves. His hands were steady. They were always steady now. The one who escaped was skilled. His wingman was not. What did it feel like? Killing an ace's wingman? Volkov looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw his younger brother Mikhail staring back. Mikhail, who had been a pilot too. Mikhail, who had died over Stalingrad when a German ace put a cannon shell through his engine. They had found his body 3 months later, frozen in the wreckage, still strapped to his seat. It felt like nothing, Volkov said. That is the problem. He walked toward the command bunker before Petrov could ask what he meant. The briefing room smelled of cigarette smoke and anxiety. Colonel Kozlov stood at a map table covered with reconnaissance photographs, red arrows marking German positions, blue arrows showing Soviet advances. The war was turning. Operation Bagration would launch in months, smashing Army Group Center, liberating Minsk, driving the fascists back toward Berlin. But first, the Luftwaffe had to be broken. The German you failed to destroy today, Kozlov said without greeting. Major Hans Brenner. 147 confirmed kills. One of the highest-scoring aces on the Eastern Front. He slid a photograph across the table, a grainy image of a middle-aged German officer standing beside a Messerschmitt decorated with kill markings. Moscow wants him eliminated. More importantly, Moscow wants proof that American aircraft are winning the air war. They want wreckage. They want a body if possible. Volkov studied the photograph. Brenner's eyes were tired. The eyes of a man who had seen too much and understood too well what was coming. You are reassigned to this mission specifically, Kozlov continued. Find him. Kill him. Bring evidence. Understood. That night, alone in his quarters, Volkov removed the worn photograph from inside his flight jacket. Mikhail smiled up at him, young and alive, wearing the new pilot's uniform their mother had been so proud of. The photograph had been taken 3 weeks before Stalingrad. 3 weeks before the end of everything, the Germans had killed his brother. Now the Germans had given him a target, an ace, a hunter, a man who had probably killed dozens of Soviet pilots just like Mikhail. This should matter. This should burn. Volkov waited for the rage to come, the hatred, the need for vengeance that was supposed to fuel men in war. Nothing came. Only the familiar emptiness, vast and cold as the steppe in winter. He tucked the photograph back into his jacket, over his heart, where he always carried it. He would hunt Brenner. He would kill him. Not for Mikhail, not for vengeance, not for glory. He would do it because it was his mission, because he was good at killing, and because he no longer knew how to do anything else. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen airbase. Somewhere west of here, a German ace was lying awake in his own darkness, thinking his own thoughts about death and survival. They were not so different, Volkov realized. Two men made into weapons by a war that had consumed everything else they might have been. Tomorrow he would fly again. Tomorrow he would hunt, but tonight, he sat with his brother's photograph and tried to remember what it felt like to be human. Two armies of clouds met above the Berezina River, white mountains colliding in slow motion while men prepared to die in the spaces between them. The weather briefing had promised clear skies. The weather briefing had lied. At 15,000 feet, a solid layer of gray stretched from horizon to horizon. Above it, in the thin blue air where oxygen grew scarce and engines struggled, the killing would begin. Major Hans Brenner checked his flight one last time before they climbed into the trap he had designed. For Messerschmitts, all that remained of his once proud squadron, hidden above the clouds, waiting. Below, a flight of Junkers Ju-88 bombers flew westward, fat and vulnerable, bait for Soviet fighters who would not resist the easy kills. The plan was simple. The Soviets would attack the bombers. The Messerschmitts would dive from above. German discipline and German tactics would triumph over Soviet numbers and American machines. Brenner almost believed it. 3 days had passed since Weber died. 3 days of nightmares, of reports ignored, of younger pilots who looked at him with doubt in their eyes. The intelligence officers insisted Soviet aircraft could not perform at altitude. Brenner knew better. He had seen the impossible with his own eyes. Today he would prove it, or die trying. 80 kilometers east, Captain Yuri Volkov led his own formation through the same gray sky. 6 P-63 Kingcobras, their Allison engines tuned for high-altitude performance, their pilots briefed on the trap they expected to find. Soviet intelligence had intercepted German communications. They knew about the bombers. They knew about the Messerschmitts hiding above. Volkov had planned accordingly. His first flight would attack the bombers and draw out the German ambush. His second flight, for more Kingcobras approaching from the northeast, would arrive when the Germans committed, catching them between two forces. The hunters would become the hunted. Lieutenant Petrov flew on Volkov's wing, steady and eager. The boy had improved in 3 days. He listened. He learned. He might survive the war if he could temper his enthusiasm with caution. Volkov doubted he would get the chance to learn. The bombers appeared below, dark shapes crawling above the cloud layer. Volkov gave the signal. His flight dove. Brenner watched from above, heart pounding against his ribs. The Soviet fighters descended on the bombers exactly as planned. He counted 6 aircraft, the new American types with their distinctive tricycle landing gear. 6 against 4, but his men had altitude advantage. All flights, attack. The Messerschmitt's dove, 4:30 seconds, the battle unfolded as Brenner had predicted. His pilots screamed down from 25,000 feet, catching the Soviets focused on the bombers. Feldwebel Richter claimed a Kingcobra with his first pass, the Russian pilot never saw him coming. The remaining Soviets scattered, climbing and turning, trying to reorganize, then the sky exploded. 4 more Kingcobras burst from the eastern clouds, climbing impossibly fast, their engines designed for exactly this kind of fight. Brenner saw them too late. His scattered flight, committed to the attack, found themselves trapped between two enemy formations. Richter died first, a Soviet cannon shell removing his wing at the root. Then Oberleutnant Frank, spinning down in flames. In 60 seconds, Brenner's trap had become his tomb. He ran for altitude, the Messerschmitt screamed as he pushed the throttle past its limits. 25,000 feet. 28,000. The air grew thin, frost forming on his canopy, his breaths coming in short gasps. Behind him, a single Kingcobra followed, the one with the red spinner, the flight leader, the hunter who would not quit. At 30,000 feet, Brenner's engine began to falter. The supercharger whined, struggling to compress the near vacuum into something the cylinders could burn. His climb rate dropped. The Soviet kept coming. Volkov watched the Germans' contrail weaken and smiled grimly. This was the Kingcobra's domain, the frozen upper air where German engineering finally failed. His own engine ran smooth and strong. The Allison supercharger, designed for American bombers that flew at 40,000 feet, barely noticed the altitude that he closed to firing range. The German pilot was skilled. Volkov recognized the desperate maneuvers, the tricks learned over years of combat. Brenner threw his aircraft into turns and dives that would have shaken any lesser pursuer. But skill could not overcome physics. At altitude, the Kingcobra was simply better. Volkov's finger tightened on the trigger, then his oil pressure warning light flickered red. He checked his gauges. Pressure dropping. Temperature rising. A mechanical failure, minor, probably survivable, but not over enemy territory. Not at 30,000 feet with 100 kilometers of frozen forest below. He had seconds to decide. The German was directly ahead, trail of smoke marking his dying engine. One burst would end him. One burst would complete the mission, avenge Mikhail, prove Soviet superiority. Volkov pulled away. He watched Brenner disappear into a cloud bank below, trailing smoke but still flying. The kill he had chased across 3 days of war escaped into the gray void. His engine coughed. He turned east, nursing the Kingcobra toward home, fury building in his chest. Not at Brenner. Not at the Germans. The machine that had betrayed him. Both men landed that evening. Both men sat alone in their quarters, shaking. The hunt was not over. The city burned beneath a twilight sky painted orange and black with smoke. Soviet artillery had been hammering the German positions for 3 days, preparing for the final assault that would liberate what remained of the urban ruins. From the air, the destruction looked almost beautiful, ribbons of fire tracing the streets, explosions blooming like deadly flowers, the whole terrible canvas illuminated by a setting sun that seemed to bleed across the horizon. Major Hans Brenner climbed toward that dying light with 2 wingmen, all that remained of his squadron after a week of slaughter. The evacuation order had come that morning. German ground forces were retreating. The airfield would be abandoned by midnight. Someone had to provide cover while the transports escaped. Brenner had volunteered. The younger pilots had looked at him with something like pity, understanding what he understood, that this was not a mission, but an ending. He had stopped pretending he would survive the war. Now he only wanted to choose the manner of his death. 40 kilometers east, Captain Yuri Volkov lifted off into the smoke-filled sky with 3 Kingcobras behind him. Lieutenant Petrov flew on his wing, steady as always, too young to understand what this mission meant. Soviet command wanted the last German air resistance eliminated. Intelligence confirmed that Brenner was among the defenders. The hunt would end tonight. Volkov climbed through the smoke layer, emerging into clear air above the burning city. The sunset painted his canopy gold and crimson. He thought of Mikhail, of Stalingrad, of all the dead who flew with him in memory. Tonight he would add another name to that list, the German ace who had escaped him twice. That he felt something stirring in his chest. Not emptiness. Something else. Something he had forgotten. The formations met at 18,000 feet, above the smoke, below the first cold stars of evening. 3 Germans against 4 Soviets. Brenner saw the Kingcobras silhouetted against the fading light and recognized the red spinner immediately. The hunter had returned. The battle erupted in a chaos of tracers and engine screams. Brenner's wingmen died in the first minute, brave men, skilled men, caught between superior numbers and superior machines. He watched them fall without despair. He had known this would happen. What mattered now was the ending. Volkov found himself tangled with a German veteran who would not quit. The man flew like a demon, turning inside Volkov's attacks, using the smoke clouds for cover, fighting with nothing left to lose. It took Volkov 30 seconds to realize he was dueling the ace himself. Then Petrov screamed over the radio. Volkov spun his head in time to see the lieutenant's Kingcobra spiraling down, smoke pouring from its engine. A German fighter. Where had it come from, pulling away from the kill? A straggler, a survivor from another unit, appearing at exactly the wrong moment. Petrov's canopy blew off. The boy tumbled into the void, parachute deploying, silk billowing white against the black smoke below. He would land in a burning city, surrounded by retreating Germans and advancing Soviets. His chances were nearly zero. Something cracked inside Volkov. The numbness he had carried since Stalingrad shattered like ice in spring. He felt the loss, raw, terrible, human. Not another name for the memorial. A boy. A friend. Gone. He screamed and threw his Kingcobra into a vertical climb, chasing Brenner toward the stars. The Germans saw him coming and climbed to meet him. Neither man was thinking tactically now. This was personal. 2 hunters who had circled each other across a week of war, finally meeting in the arena where it would end. At 30,000 feet, Brenner's engine began to die. He had pushed it beyond all limits, and now it coughed, sputtered, fell silent. The Messerschmitt stalled, nose dropping, beginning the fatal spin toward Earth. Volkov followed, finger on the trigger. 1 burst. 1 kill. Vengeance for Petrov, for Mikhail, for every Soviet pilot this German had ever killed. He watched Brenner fight his dying aircraft. The German did not bail out. He struggled with his controls, trying to restart the engine, refusing to surrender even to gravity. At 15,000 feet, impossibly, the motor caught. Brenner pulled out of the spin, leveling off above the treetops, trailing smoke but still alive. Volkov descended behind him, cannon armed, kill certain. He did not fire. He could not explain it, not to his commanders, not to himself. He saw Brenner's aircraft crawling forward, wounded and slow, and he understood that this man was not his enemy. Not truly. They were both weapons, forged by the same war, aimed at each other by men who would never fly, never fight, never know what it cost to kill another human being. Volkov pulled alongside the German. For a long moment, they flew in formation, Soviet and German, hunter and prey, 2 men who had every reason to destroy each other and no reason to show mercy. Brenner turned his head. Through the canopies, across the impossible gulf between their nations, their eyes met. The German dipped his wings, the old pilot's salute, older than this war, older than their countries, a gesture from the first days of flight when enemies could still be honorable. Volkov returned it, then he turned east, toward home, leaving the German ace to find his own way to whatever ending awaited him. He landed in darkness, taxied to the dispersal area, shut down his engine. The ground crew approached with questions he could not answer. He climbed down from the Kingcobra, removed his brother's photograph from his flight jacket, and looked at Mikhail's face in the dim light. The tears came without warning. Not for the German he had spared. Not for himself. For Petrov. For Mikhail. For every young pilot who would never grow old. He wept until his chest ached, until his eyes burned, until the emptiness inside him finally began to fill with something else. Grief. Sorrow. The terrible, beautiful weight of being human. The war would continue. More men would die. But tonight,
above a burning city, two enemies had recognized each other as men. It was not victory. It was not defeat. It was enough.